I was standing at the edge of the dance floor, champagne flute warm in my hand, when my father tapped the microphone and told 200 wedding guests that I was the family's greatest disappointment. I heard the words roll through the gilded ballroom the way sound travels underwater. Distorted, slowed, arriving in my chest before they reached my mind. Greatest disappointment. He had said it privately 1,000 times across 1,000 ordinary dinners. But there is a different gravity to cruelty when it is amplified, when it is witnessed, when it is dressed up in a linen suit and framed between toasts about family legacy. I stood there and did not move. I had learned, over many years, the particular discipline of not moving when you want to disappear. But the worst moment of that evening had nothing to do with my father's speech. It came 43 minutes later, when my phone buzzed inside my satin clutch with a message that was not meant for me. And in 4 sentences, I understood that everything I had quietly grieved over 2 long years had been taken from me on purpose. The text was from my sister's wedding planner, a woman named Dana Lish, who had apparently saved my number under my mother's name in her contacts. It read, "Eleanor, the wire transfer to the offshore account cleared this morning. The property deed is being filed under Megan's name as discussed. Clara still doesn't know. We're safe." A second message arrived 30 seconds later. "Delete after reading. I'll call Monday." I read them both standing beside a centerpiece of white peonies and trailing eucalyptus, with the string quartet playing something soft and golden behind me, and 200 people eating petit fours around me. I read them 6 times. Then I set my phone face down on the white tablecloth and breathed, slowly, deliberately, the way you breathe when you are standing at the edge of something very high, and the ground below has not yet resolved into anything recognizable. To understand how I ended up in that vineyard ballroom holding proof of my own family's theft, you need to understand the life I had built before that night, and the life they had always, quietly, consistently told me was wrong. My name is Clara Whitmore. 34 years old, senior financial analyst at a consulting firm in Portland, Oregon. 6 years in the same East Side apartment with north-facing windows and a coffee maker I chose carefully and love without apology. There is a cast iron skillet on my stovetop seasoned through 4 years of weekend cooking, and a tabby cat named Fig who sleeps on my feet with the loyalty of something that chose me rather than was assigned to me. My life is quiet and precise and entirely without performance, mine. I built it from scratch with my own salary and my own willingness to disappoint people who had different plans for me. My younger sister Megan had occupied, from birth, a categorically different position in our parents' cosmology. Where I was stubborn, she was spirited. Where I was difficult, she was passionate. Where I made choices they found baffling. Declining law school, moving to Portland, dating a man named Joel who wore flannel and could name every native plant in the Willamette Valley. Megan made choices they framed on the wall. She married Thomas Hargrove at 27, a tall, golf-playing man in commercial real estate who attended the right schools. She lived 10 minutes from my parents. She sent my mother flowers for every occasion, and several she invented. She was, in the vocabulary of Robert and Eleanor Whitmore, a success story. I had made my peace with most of this. There is a particular quietude in accepting you will never win a competition you never agreed to enter. I had perfected the technique of absorbing small incisions disguised as concern. "Don't you think it's time, Clara? Your grandmother always wanted to see you settled. Megan has a real plan for her life. What's yours? and letting them pass through me like cold air through a cracked window. Noted and released. What made all of it genuinely painful rather than merely tedious was my grandmother. Ruth Ellison had been my mother's mother, and the one person in my family who looked at me without measuring the distance between who I was and who she wished I'd be. She had taught third grade for 31 years and then retired to a Victorian house in Napa with climbing roses on the porch and a kitchen that always smelled of lemon zest and something warm in the oven. She died at 81 in her own bed, which was the way she'd always said she wanted to go. 6 months before she got sick, in that same kitchen, with tea and mismatched cups, she told me about the will. "Your mother gets her portion," Ruth said, holding her mug with both hands the way she did when she wanted to be understood clearly. "But yours is separate, Clara. $80,000. And first right of refusal on the Napa property if it ever sells. I want you to have something that belongs entirely to you, something nobody can argue you out of." She said that last sentence with a careful precision that I understood even then was not incidental. I squeezed her hand and told her I loved her, and she patted my fingers and said, "I know you do, sweetheart. That has always been more than enough." After Ruth died, my mother Eleanor was named executor of the estate. She was Ruth's daughter. She lived nearby. She had always been organized in the way of women who use efficiency as armor. I had been handed paperwork, signed things, trusted her. Because grief blurs the fine print, and she was my mother, and mothers, even difficult ones, do not steal from their children. I was told probate was ongoing. Complications, delays, things being finalized. Almost 2 years passed. Every time I asked, Eleanor deflected with a vocabulary of administrative complexity that I, a financial analyst, should have examined far more critically than I did. I noted the delays with irritation. I had not yet noted them with alarm. I should have noted them with alarm long before a vineyard wedding in September. The weeks leading up to Megan's wedding had their own particular, weary texture. My bridesmaid invitation had arrived 3 months before the ceremony, by email, 2 months after the other bridesmaids, all of whom had been fitted together at a winery party I was never informed of. My dress measurements were collected over a phone call. The dusty rose satin chosen for the bridal party technically fit my frame, but did something unkind to my complexion that I suspected was not entirely accidental. The first strange thing happened 2 days before the wedding. I came downstairs early, intending to make coffee before anyone was awake, and heard my mother's voice in the living room, not raised but concentrated, the way her voice got when she was negotiating something. "It only matters that she doesn't see the Napa paperwork before Sunday," she was saying, and then a pause, and then, "Once Megan and Thomas are settled, it becomes a different conversation. She'll make a fuss, she always does, but there's nothing actionable. We've been careful." I stood on the cold kitchen tile in my bare feet for a long moment. The refrigerator hummed. The early light came through the window in a thin stripe across the floor. I told myself it was wedding logistics. I told myself I had filtered ordinary conversation through my own complicated feelings about being home. I was very good at telling myself these things. I had been practicing for years. The second strange thing happened at the rehearsal dinner when I arrived early and passed the private dining room with its door standing 2 inches open. I caught Thomas's mother, Patricia Hargrove, speaking with my mother in low, focused voices, and heard the phrase, "Make sure the title transfer posts before anyone has time to question it," before a waiter appeared and the moment dissolved. I carried that phrase to my table. I turned it over during the toasts. Then I set it down with the determination of a woman who has had her instincts dismissed so many times she has learned to distrust them herself. The third thing happened on the morning of the wedding, in the bridal suite, while the makeup artist and hairstylist moved between us in a warm haze of hairspray and white lilies. Megan reached over without looking at me and took my hand. "I love you, Clara," she said quietly. "I really hope today is a good day for you." Not, "I'm so glad you're here." Not, "Can you believe this is actually happening?" But something slow and careful, weighted with a tenderness that felt in retrospect less like sisterly affection and more like a woman preparing herself for something she had decided she could not stop. I squeezed her hand. I told her I loved her too. I looked at our reflections in the mirror and I tried to hold on to the truth of that moment. I tried very hard. The ceremony was everything an expensive vineyard wedding is required to be. White flowers, golden September light, Thomas crying during his vows, Megan radiant in a way that caught in my chest because she was still my sister, and I had known her every age, and I loved her, regardless of what I did not yet know. The reception was on the upper terrace, strung with warm Edison lights that came on as the sun dropped below the ridge. I found my table, one removed from the family table, between Thomas's college roommate and a second cousin I barely knew. I ate the salmon. I made conversation. I watched the evening proceed with the professional detachment of someone who has attended many events where they are technically present but structurally marginal. The speeches began at 7:30. Thomas's best man was charming and brief. Patricia Hargrove was gracious. My mother gave a speech about Megan so warm and so beautifully constructed that it made the room cry, which was a performance I had to admire even as it scraped at something sore. Then my father stood. Robert Whitmore was not naturally eloquent. He was an engineer, comfortable with specifications and economical with language. But that evening he had prepared, or been prepared. He spoke about family legacy. He spoke about values. He talked about Megan with 3 minutes of genuine precision and tenderness. Then he paused. He looked directly at me across the terrace with an expression I have spent many hours since trying to categorize, something compounded of regret and resolve and the particular discomfort of a man executing a plan he did not fully design. And he said, "Every family has its challenges. Not every child takes the path you hope for them. Some remind you every year that the map you drew was not theirs to follow." A pause that felt surgical. We are grateful that at least one of our daughters understood what it truly means to be part of a family. He raised his glass to Megan. 200 people raised their glasses. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and my face arranged into the careful blankness I had built across 3 decades of practice. The cousin beside me glanced over with mild discomfort. The college roommate studied his wine. The applause filled the vineyard terrace like something inevitable. 43 minutes later, my phone buzzed. I almost did not look at it. I was midway through a conversation about the Pacific Coast Highway that required nothing of me except nodding. But the buzz came twice in quick succession, and something, instinct or fate, or simply the ordinary bad luck of picking up your phone at the wrong moment, made me reach into my clutch. My grandmother's $80,000, the Napa property, 23 months of complications and delays and things being finalized, filed under Megan's name, with an offshore wire transfer that had cleared that morning, while I stood in a dusty rose bridesmaid dress 2 tables from my mother and smiled through my father calling me the family's cautionary tale. I set my phone face down on the white tablecloth. The night air smelled of jasmine and crushed grass and the faint sweetness of the vineyard below the terrace. The Edison lights swayed in the evening breeze. Somewhere across the room, Megan laughed at something Thomas whispered. Bright and unguarded, the laugh she'd had since she was 12. My mother moved between tables with the ease of a woman who believed the hardest part was behind her. I sat very still, and for the first time in a very long time, I stopped telling myself I was imagining things. I did not storm across the terrace. I did not stand up and overturn the table. What I did was sit very quietly for 4 minutes and 40 seconds. I know the exact duration because I watched the clock on my phone while I waited for my hands to stop shaking, and think with the cold, meticulous clarity of a person who has just been handed every answer to every question she should have asked 2 years ago. The first thing I did was forward the messages to my personal email, to a cloud account my family had no access to, and to my own number as a backup copy. I took 3 screenshots and forwarded those too. I was a financial analyst. I understood in a way that was almost impersonal in that moment that the messages were not just evidence of betrayal. They were evidence of estate fraud, misappropriation of trust assets, unauthorized transfer of funds from a named beneficiary, deliberate concealment across 23 months. And my mother had made a serious mistake in trusting a wedding planner who had not updated her contacts. I stood. I smoothed my dusty rose dress. I told Thomas's college roommate it had been a genuinely lovely conversation and excused myself with a smile that I am certain looked completely normal, because I had been producing completely normal smiles at events where I was breaking apart inside since the age of 17. Then I walked across the terrace, past the Edison lights and the white peonies and the dancing guests, and found my mother standing near the bar. I waited until she was alone. Then I stepped beside her and said, in the pleasantly neutral tone I used for conference calls where I needed people to agree before they understood what they were agreeing to, "Dana Lish messaged me by accident tonight. I think you'll want to step away from the bar." My mother went still, not with surprise, with the stillness of a woman whose plan has encountered an obstacle she had not anticipated and is rapidly recalculating. Eleanor Whitmore had the angular, carefully maintained composure of someone who had never let herself go in any sense of the phrase, and in that moment she was spectacular in the way of dangerous things, perfectly controlled on the surface, while something very different moved underneath. She set her wine glass down. "Let's find somewhere quiet," she said. We sat on a stone bench at the edge of the vineyard, away from the terrace lights, where the dark came in properly and the reception noise reduced to something distant and ambient. The grass smelled of evening damp. My mother sat with her back straight and her hands folded, and I showed her the messages on my screen. She looked at them for a long time. Then she said, with a calmness I had to respect, even as it infuriated me, "You've misunderstood the context." "Tell me the context," I said. The estate had tax complications. There were restructuring requirements. Your grandmother's original instructions weren't legally tenable. We did what the attorneys advised. "Which attorneys?" I said. "Name them." She adjusted the clasp of her bracelet instead of answering. "What offshore account?" I said. "Which attorney told you to wire funds offshore and file a property deed in Megan's name? Give me that attorney's name right now, and I will call them tonight." The silence between us was thick with the chemistry of a lie, meeting the specific intelligence it was designed to fool. My mother had always made the mistake of believing that because I was the daughter who left, I was the daughter who was not paying attention. She had mistaken my independence for absence, my willingness to let things go for an inability to see things clearly. "We did what was necessary to protect the family," she said at last. "Whose family?" I said. She said nothing. "That was Grandma Ruth's money," I said, and my voice was very quiet, with an edge beneath it that I had not used on her in 34 years of being her daughter. She sat in her kitchen and told me exactly what she was leaving me and why. "You have been lying to my face for almost 2 years while you moved it somewhere I couldn't reach. That is not a tax complication. That is fraud." My mother stood. "You are being emotional," which is exactly the problem. It is always the problem with you, Clara. You take everything personally. This was a financial decision for the family's long-term stability, and if you would simply sit down and look at the actual— "I want to see the actual documents," I said. "I have wanted to see the actual documents for 23 months. Every time I asked, you told me there were delays." I stood too, because I was not going to let her stand above me for this conversation. "So, yes, I absolutely want to see the documents tomorrow morning, with an attorney present, mine." Something recalibrated in her face, not softening but recalculating, then in a lower voice. "Think carefully about what you're doing. This affects the whole family. It affects Megan." "Then Megan should have thought about that," I said. I turned and walked back toward the lights of the reception. I found my father at the edge of the terrace, alone with his scotch, watching the valley below. He was a tall man who had shrunk at the shoulders in recent years, the way men do when the authority they built their posture around has quietly relocated. I stood beside him and said, without preamble, "You knew. That speech tonight, you needed me discredited in front of witnesses so that when this came out, people would remember I was the unstable one, the one who always took things personally." I looked at him steadily. The speech was insurance. My father turned his glass slowly in his hands. "Your mother made decisions she believed were right for the family," he said. "I supported her. That's what a marriage is." "That's what a conspiracy is," I said. He flinched. Small, brief. I did not miss it. "I'm going to a probate attorney Monday," I said. "You have the weekend to decide which side of this you want to be on." I put my water glass on the railing. "Good night, Dad." I did not sleep. I sat in my childhood bedroom until 4 a.m, compiling everything I could reach, Ruth's exact words from my journal, every email about the estate across 23 months, every date, every deflection, every administrative excuse. At 4:15, I texted my college friend Rachel, an estate attorney in San Francisco, who had told me for 2 years, with increasing firmness, that I should not be relying on verbal updates from the executor of an estate I was named in. The text said, "You were right. I need your help. Call me when you're awake." She called at 6:47. I told her everything. There was a pause, and then she said, "How do you feel?" "Functional," I said. "I'll feel the rest of it later." "Okay, then hear me clearly. What you're describing is not a family misunderstanding. Unauthorized transfer of trust assets, concealment of executor activity from a named beneficiary, offshore structuring to avoid detection. That is potential criminal fraud. Your mother could face personal liability as executor." A pause. "This is serious, Clara." I had known this in the analytical part of my brain since the previous night. Hearing it stated plainly by someone else was a different experience. I sat in my childhood bedroom with the gray morning light coming through the window, and I felt the full weight of it settle into my chest. not the anger, which had been cold and useful through the night, but the grief underneath the anger, which was much heavier and which was going to take a very long time. Rachel kept talking. I kept listening. We made a plan. Megan found me that afternoon in the garden, sitting on the stone step beside the climbing roses, a cutting from Ruth's Napa garden, which had grown along the back fence with more stubbornness than anyone had expected. She sat beside me without speaking for a moment. She had changed out of her wedding dress and looked very young. She looked like my sister. "How long did you know?" I asked. She looked at her hands. "About a year," she said. The number landed like something dropped from height. A year. "Mom said the estate was being restructured for tax reasons, that you'd been informed. I wanted to believe her." A long pause. "I know how that sounds." "In the bridal suite," I said. "I hope today is a good day for you." I looked at her directly. "That was you trying to warn me." She pressed her lips together. "I didn't know how to... I was already in it, Clara. The property is in my name. If I came to you, I exposed myself too." She met my eyes. "I know exactly how that sounds." I thought about Ruth choosing those precise words, something nobody can argue you out of, and looking at me with such steadiness, and how clearly she had already seen what was coming. I thought about my sister sitting here telling me she had known for a year. "I have a lawyer," I said. "She files Monday. The process may result in criminal charges against Mom. I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing it because it is my money and my grandmother's intention, and I will not pretend otherwise to keep the peace." I paused. "If you cooperate and provide documentation, your own exposure is significantly reduced. Rachel told me so directly." Megan wiped her eyes. "I'll cooperate," she said quietly. "I'll give you everything." What followed was 11 months of subpoenas, depositions, forensic accounting, and the particular exhausting bureaucracy of probate litigation. My mother denied everything for the first 3 months. My father gave a deposition in which he used the phrase, "I supported my wife's decisions," 14 times, which managed to function as both a defense and a confession simultaneously. The offshore account was in the Cayman Islands. The Napa property had been sold 9 months after Ruth's death, quietly, quickly, to a buyer whose professional connection to Patricia Hargrove, Thomas's mother, explained every conversation I had overheard at the rehearsal dinner. The wedding had been, in some quiet, structural way, a closing ceremony for a financial arrangement that had been in motion long before the invitations were sent. Megan learned this when I did. I will not claim to know exactly what that knowledge cost her. Megan's testimony, delivered with evident distress and complete accuracy, was the piece that made the civil case irrefutable. She had records. She had emails. She had been a witness more than a co-conspirator, and Rachel established that distinction early and held it firmly. My mother settled. The trust had been breached in ways that could not be explained away, and the Cayman account produced a paper trail her attorney could not neutralize. The settlement returned the $80,000 plus interest and legal fees, plus a negotiated portion of the Napa sale proceeds. My mother was formally removed as executor of any future family trusts and required to sign a written acknowledgement of the breach of fiduciary duty. It was not the courtroom I had wanted. It was final, and it was enough. My parents and I do not speak. There was no dramatic ending, no slam doors, no final speeches, just the quiet, permanent distance that forms between people when the trust that makes a relationship possible has been examined and found to have never really been there. Megan and I talk. Not easily, not often, but we talk. We had coffee in San Francisco 3 months after the settlement. We talked about Ruth carefully and at length. We moved carefully around everything else. She is working on it. So am I. 8 months after that September wedding, on a Friday evening in late May, I drove to Napa. The Victorian house had been sold, but I drove to the street and sat in front of it for a while. The climbing roses were still there, gone somewhat unpruned on one side of the porch, reaching past the second-floor window with the persistence of things that have been growing longer than anyone has been tending them. The new owners had painted the front door blue. Ruth would have found that entirely acceptable. I had bought a small craftsman bungalow in Portland with part of the settlement, a house on a tree-lined street with a front porch and a garden that needed work, which was exactly how I wanted it. Fig has claimed the bay window in the living room. Rachel came to the housewarming and brought wine and made a toast to Ruth Ellison, who had wanted to give me something nobody could argue me out of, and who had not been entirely wrong. I stood on my porch one evening with my coffee mug warm in both hands, the garden catching the last of the light below me, the street quiet and unhurried. I thought about all the years I had spent telling myself I was imagining things, about the long practice of absorbing small cuts and calling it peace, about the specific cost of mistaking silence for safety and compliance for love. I was done with all of that now. The garden needed work. The roses needed planting. I had a list and a shovel and all the time in the world, and not a single person on earth who could argue me out of any of it.